Hi, this is Emily Freitag with Instruction Partners, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Jamila Newman at TNTP. And Jamila is down the road from me in Memphis, and excited to talk in this series about what do we know to be true about how we intervene effectively and accelerate student learning, and what do we know does not work. But as with all of these, want to start in a personal place. So Jamila, thank you for joining us, and please just tell us your story and what that taught you about learning.
Way back when, I was born in Kansas City, Kansas, and was lucky enough in Kansas City to go to Black-owned private schools where my parents sacrificed a lot on their graduate student degree salaries to have my brother and I go to the best education facilities possible. And probably in kinder, I started to go to public school, and I distinctly remember being in that classroom, and all I can remember from that time was that my kindergarten teacher really liked Carmex. And so it was the most visceral and clear image that I have. And we moved from Kansas City when I was going into second grade, and we moved to a small town in Ohio, Yellow Springs, Ohio. And it was the first time that I felt behind. And I was like, I'm really struggling to read. I was a proficient reader in terms of I could read the words on the page, but making sense of those words was a struggle for me. I was also a really quiet child. And so this is when IEPs and titling programs were just kind of starting to wake up in the country. And so they were on their way to sending me to a special education classroom. My mom came in and she's like, she can do the work, she just doesn't like to talk. And she was like, test her again. They tested me again. And I did have a reading comprehension issue. And I really think it was a strong reflection of where the country was when we think about the reading wars. My brother had a teacher who was very quote old school, taught systematic phonics. My brother to this day is a stronger speller than I am. To break down complex words is very different. And now in hindsight, looking in on it as an educator, I can understand the experience that he had in education versus the experience that I had. And I still feel the ramifications of that today. And getting those low grades early on in reading comprehension still to this day lead me to believe oh, maybe I'm not the strong reader, or maybe I'm struggling to interpret what people are saying to me. And so that's really carried forward in how I approach my work and how I think about my work, both from a perspective of how do we support students who may have some unfinished learning, and how do we communicate with parents about that unfinished learning and communicate to kids about that unfinished learning in ways that don't create further trauma or stigmatize students, and give them a sense that they can't belong or don't belong in a highly rigorous educational environment.
Thank you so much for sharing that. TNTP has done so much work, and most recently the opportunity myth was, I think, so instructive to this moment. Tell us now from your seat as an educator, as an education leader, what you have seen over time from experience and research and practice. What do we know actually does work?
So I think asking that question of what does work in this environment is really tricky, because we're as a nation facing, really unprecedented times. And so we've started to really pivot and say, while we might not know exactly what works, we know what has not worked and what has served our students well. And we're really starting to push people on the science of their teaching. And what is it rooted in? Is it rooted in what you experienced as a learner? Is it rooted in kind of folklore of teaching? Or is it rooted in really the research and the best practice and the science that we know as a field? And so we're really trying to talk about the triangulation or the narrowing of the gap between the science and the teaching that we do so that we can really capitalize on our learning. So I think what we do know has not worked is we know that leveling students and only having them read material on their independent reading level has not been successful. It hasn't successfully served students well. We know that not providing students with systematic foundational skill instruction has not served them well. We know that not marrying writing with what students are reading has not served students well. We know that not allowing students to have lots of at-bats with complex texts has not served them well. Have we always acted on what we know? And in the words of the Levens, have we done better because we know better? Not so much. And so I think that's the piece of like, that I'm excited about where we are right now in the educational community, is that I'm hoping that this experience is really creating a forcing mechanism for folks to say, in some ways we've got to get out of our own way, and get out of the way of students as adults, because we've known a lot of best practices for years, but we haven't been comfortable really demanding it of other adults or even ourselves to make that change. And I think this really calls for an opportunity to do that.
I agree. Take us into the opportunity myth a little bit more deeply, in particular, and you know, this is looking back at instruction before COVID, of course, but what did you all learn about the truth of the student experience, and in particular, the equity of instructional access?
One, I think our research really aligned to research that was already out there, that students are very perceptive about the education experiences that they're having. And I think often as adults, we've discounted their perceptions, but they are very accurate and real in many ways. I think we also had the assumption that when we as educators or skilled observers saw something as like high quality or as engaging from like an observer's perspective, that students would also feel the same way, and that was not the case. There is so much more power than we even necessarily initially believed in high expectations and strong instruction, and the relationships that teachers have with students that really play into how students engage with even high quality materials. So it kind of really enforced this idea that high quality materials will give you a significant lift, but they are not the only thing that you need to be thinking about and considering.
Let me just pause you to have you say that again, because I think that's really, so there was so much more about the relationship between strong instruction, high expectations, student-teacher relationships, I think I heard, and the curricular materials as sort of an enabler of all of that, than you even realized. Dig in just a little bit more.
Yeah, I think we thought that there was a cleaner or clear arrow between if we saw high quality materials in the classroom that was like strongly aligned, or if we had evaluated something as being strong instruction, like aligned to what the material, like unpack the learning, that would lead to students being more engaged. But that equation didn't always work. And so and as we kind of rethink our teacher development framework, it really pushed us to think beyond even the 4 resources of like, yes, the 4 resources matter, but there's this innate need for students and, you know, humans and adults in general to feel a sense of belonging, to feel a sense of relevance and purpose, to feel like, to have growth mindsets being really activated in class. That really is what activates the learning in a way, activates and accelerates the learning in a way that we didn't even necessarily hypothesize going in. We kind of thought like high quality materials are going to be the thing that like really grabs students' engagement and really attention. And they did do a lot of strong things for students, but there was so much skill and nuance from the teacher needed to lift those materials off. I think the research really illuminated for us.
That's becoming a theme in these conversations too, is just like these camps that we've previously had, really, it's the middle ground that we need to find.
Right.
dig in a little bit more on expectations. I know that was a place that, I think that was a place that you did find a little bit of a clearer arrow.
Yeah. Yeah. So expectations was kind of the leading piece where, especially for students who were the furthest behind, had the biggest impact on their growth within a year. And so it made us really think about how are we orienting teachers to really begin thinking about like, what is the classroom that you're going to experience? And we've been talking a lot about like classroom archetypes even. How are we kind of setting the record straight about what the average classroom in America is, so that teachers aren't having this like false narrative of if a child is behind, it means, or has unfinished learning, that it means something like detrimental or something is wrong with the student, that it is almost the rule as opposed to the exception that you're going to have students with unfinished learning. It's the rule and not the exception that you're going to have students who are multilingual learners. It's the rule, not the exception, that you're going to have students who you're going to need to be cognizant of any biases related to socioeconomic status. And so I think there is so much unpacking of that needed to happen, that is playing into the expectations that teachers have, both about their students' ability to do the work and their own ability to make that growth happen for kids. And so that was something that we started to unpack. And I think it was also, how are we defining what high expectations looks like? I think in the past, we've used models that kind of espoused high expectations, but didn't necessarily enact them. So, you know, people using cheers or chants or putting, you know, college things on the wall, those are all important. But if in our day-to-day actions, we're putting work in front of students that doesn't express high expectations, or day-to-day interactions with students or their families, we're not being honest with them about where they are in terms of their achievement or proficiency, then that really erodes the honesty of our high expectations that we might be holding. So I think it just has created in us a push to explore like how we've kind of signed off on like, check, you have high expectations, versus really digging in with people and asking questions and engaging in focus groups or, you know, one-on-one conversations with teachers that really begin to unpack or uncover their perceptions, either positive or negative, about the communities that they're going to work in.
And it's so much, I like that. And I think it's so true. It resonates to my own teaching experience. It's like, for what students do you have high expectations? For what are you more likely to not? And then just anchoring that back to the power that we know that those expectations have on what we do in our actions.
And we've really just been trying to ask this question related to high expectations, to your point of like, who's achieving within your system and why are they achieving, and who's not, like who and what's happening there, and consistently asking that why question and digging in with folks. Because I think what we've also really surprisingly found is, if you're looking at the data from a much more high level, macro level, you can walk away from a district or a system feeling really good. But start digging into more of the subgroups and at the classroom or school level, that's when you really see the disparities and inequities come alive. And so we've really been pushing in our data analysis with clients to go much deeper by asking that question, and then using our work with them to really dig in and analyze data in a much deeper way.
So as you think to the task ahead, let's not say the fall, let's say, you know, the day will come when there is either a treatment or a vaccine, and there is an end of a pandemic. You know, what do you hope educators will think about and do in the spirit of the evidence we have about what works to accelerate learning?
I think the first thing is we've got to figure out better ways to learn from each other, to collaborate, and to take things to scale. I think so many of my clients struggle to learn about best practices that are out there and to them in a way that really allows them to think through the conditions and context that made that work, as opposed to just like, I overheard randomly that someone out there is doing X, I'm going to try it here, without kind of knowing all the moving parts of why that was successful. So that's one. I think the other thing in terms of accelerating learning is you can look at the concept of accelerated learning and think of it as simply a reshuffling of the standards deck in your world of like, I'm just moving standards from here to here, and not really understanding how it needs to marry strong instruction and socio-emotional responsiveness within that world. Because if you're just plowing ahead with accelerated learning, you can, in fact, cause more trauma to your system. And so I hope that systems adopt the idea of accelerated learning, that we can put students in grade level appropriate content much faster and much more frequently than we have in the past. And also that in order to do that, we've got to really start to build skill with both leaders and teachers about what effective differentiation and scaffolding looks like, so that we're not reducing the rigor of our instruction, but maintaining that bar. And I think the other piece that I'm hoping is that this process really allows us to trim the fat from our instructional practices so that we can more closely examine our instruction or vertical spine, whatever we want to say or call it. And what I mean by examine, I think there's a lot of conversation right now about diagnostics and assessments and understanding where students are. And in response to COVID, but I don't necessarily know if we've always come back to the idea of, even before COVID, our assessments were not doing the job that we needed them to do. I don't necessarily know if I personally would have put a stamp on any assessment as giving teachers or educators the tools that they needed to really strongly inform their instructional practice. And I think we need to decide as a nation and country, what are these assessments for? Are they simply to give us a benchmark for students, or are they to drive instruction? And maybe it's a combination of the things, but I think what I hope from this whole process is that it's forcing us to ask the big questions about what do we really need from education? What do we need from educators? What lanes do we need individuals to play? And where have we kind of just been spinning the wheels or adding things that are kind of unproductive or unsuccessful, or we haven't seen the return on investment, and like get rid of it, because the education landscape is already crowded enough and it's become overcrowded in this space. And so that's really what I'm hoping.
We hear so much from educators that feel so bombarded right now. Thank you, Jamila, for joining us, for sharing your thoughts as we continue to explore these questions together about how we rethink intervention. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate it.
Bye.